Isn't that amazing? Through the power of masterful orchestration, Maurice Ravel was able to take an old piano piece by Mussorgsky and give it new life as one of the greatest orchestral works of the 20th century. Hello, I'm Adam Schreiber. I'm a composer and a cellist currently studying at the East Carolina University School of Music. Inspired by Ravel, I'd recently decided to take my own crack at orchestrating a piano piece. Today's video will just be me going over what I've done and showing off some techniques about basic orchestration and how to avoid some simple mistakes. I chose to orchestrate a short, light-hearted dance movement from one of the piano sonatas by a Russian composer named Nikolai Medtner. Medtner was a contemporary and good friend of Rachmaninoff, and his style is in some ways very similar. This short dance piece, called Danza Graziosa, serves as a great starting point for learning just how to orchestrate piano music. The goal of my orchestration was to simply take the piece that Medtner had written and translate it for orchestra while maintaining the original lighthearted, playful, dance-like character of the piece, but elaborating on the colors through instrumentation. You have to remember that orchestras are not made up of instruments, but they're actually made up of people. So this guide will hopefully help you make sure that your orchestrations are not only playable, but practical. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank my composition professor, Dr. Eddie Jacobs, for helping me find some of the resources for this project. With that being said, let's begin. The first step to orchestrating a piano piece is to find a good recording and really listen. Really listen without looking at the score and notice the different phrases, sections, and characters that are evoked in the recording. Listen for these different sound qualities and imagine which instruments could best emulate these qualities. Without looking at a score, you won't be distracted visually so that you can focus solely on hearing the intentions of the composer and the performer. The next step is to listen again, but this time do it while reading the score so that now you can see what's really going on. As a side note, if you're a piano player, go ahead and just try reading the piece at a piano. Getting the music under your fingers might actually help you understand the voices. That being said, let's go ahead and just take a listen to the piece. Now I'm going to stop there just after the beginning part, but after listening to this whole piece, I thought, okay, this is a lighthearted, charming, and fun little piece that would work best for a smaller, Haydn-sized orchestra. The next thing that I thought was that in the beginning section, I imagined playful pizzicato in the strings, and perhaps even light woodwinds on top of that. This is the way that you should be listening and thinking to get the best results. If you're asking, where do I even get these ideas? Well, the key to becoming a good orchestrator is having a vast knowledge of other orchestral music, as well as having knowledge of all the instruments in the orchestra. Having this knowledge is the key to knowing what works and what doesn't work in orchestration. I read this great article online for beginning orchestrators written by this award-winning composer whose name I can't pronounce. He suggested that, say you have a friend that plays an instrument like clarinet or whatever, maybe invite him over for some coffee and ask him to tell you about his instrument. In my personal opinion, the best resource for figuring out how an instrument works is from a person who actually plays the instrument. However, there are some great books and some great online sources. One resource that you'll find exceptionally useful is this sort of online interactive instrument encyclopedia put together by the Indiana Jacobs School of Music. It's called Instrument Studies for Eyes and Ears. It gives you musical examples along with a video to demonstrate the different techniques and ranges of the different instruments. I highly recommend it. So basically, you just really need to know how every instrument works and what their limitations are, and then you really need to just study as many scores as you can. The piece starts with a bouncy introduction. The descending parallel fifths pattern on the downbeats in the bass move the progression of the alternating offbeat chords in the right hand. Marked con moto leggero, meaning with light motion, this section's quick pace, short articulation, and playful manner are best suited for string pizzicato. In my approach, the cello and viola play alternating the left-hand notes, while the violins play the right-hand notes. Note that I gave the highest and most important voice to the first violins, as well as to the first flute, and the other two voices of the chord divided by the second violins, giving the upper voice slightly more power in the overall sound. I chose to just hold off on the double basses for now, as their sound would just be too heavy for the overall texture. Later in the piece, when this exact same passage repeats itself between the B and C sections, I changed the orchestration slightly, giving the melodies to the winds and omitting most of the string pizzicato except for the cello, but still maintaining the light, playful character. In the woodwind version of this section, I gave the bassoons both the downbeats and the offbeats slurred together, exactly like how it's written in the left hand of the piano part. This creates a slightly sustained effect that sort of fills out the texture of the group sound. In order to make this passage playable, I had the two bassoons alternate between groups of two. A good way to make a passage less difficult is to split it up between two or more players of the same instrument. This will come into play later in the piece. In translating the next section from the piano score to an orchestral arrangement, I had to identify a clear melodic line and a clear accompaniment. By looking at the piano part, it's clear from measure 9 to 16 that the right hand part is the sole melodic line, as it is monophonic, meaning one voice, and contains phrase markings such as slurs, crescendo/decrescendo, and the text cantando con molto tenerezza, which means singing and very tenderly. In order to make the line really sing out, I chose the solo oboe because of its rich and sonorous color, which lends itself perfectly for this melody. The accompanimental texture is made up of just pizzicato strings, no bass yet because it's still too heavy, and light first bassoon doubling the cello's bass line. This whole section feels like ragtime music that's been slowed down and softened up, which makes sense because in the biography Nicholas Metner, His Life and Music by Barry Martin, it says that Metner was heavily inspired by ragtime music during the writing of this piece. In ragtime music, there's a melodic line in the right hand, usually boasting jazzy syncopated rhythms, just like in this piece, while the left hand jumps from a bass note to a chord in alteration, also just like in this piece. Although the rhythm and harmonic progression can be seen as similar to ragtime music, the overall mood and character of this piece is much more subdued and cantabile. In measure 13, things start to gain intensity as the melody is marked crescendo, and the left-hand notes no longer are slurred and marked staccato. I express this by having the strings switch from pizzicato to arco, giving a much more sustained and full sound, while the first violins join the oboe in the melody. Going into measure 17, the climax of the phrase is reached, with the peak dynamic of forte. I give each instrument an increased dynamic from before. The flutes take up the melody at a tempo. I decide to have them in octaves, the upper octave being my own addition, just because the high flute really cuts through the texture and creates an interesting, contrasting color that I felt really fits well in this context. Here, I also added the double basses, doubling the cello line in the same octave. Remember that double basses sound an octave lower than written. But here, the basses are playing pizz, as well as the second bassoon, which doubles the first bassoon, in order to increase the amount of bass in the texture, ramping up the overall intensity of the phrase. Also at the climax of this phrase, Mettner adds descending chromatic harmonizing notes in the right hand. I employ these notes in the form of soft sustained notes in the clarinet, as well as a ragtime-esque rhythmic pattern in the first violins in divisi. I created this pattern by taking notes from the melody and the harmony and slurring between them. As the phrase diminuendos to a restatement of the melody's second subject, I have the texture lighten up slightly to make room for a playfully articulated clarinet solo. If you're wondering, how do I translate the articulation of a piano to that of a woodwind instrument when playing a melodic line? The best way to figure this out is to try playing it on a woodwind instrument. However, if you're a pianist like me and you don't really play any woodwind instruments, then I highly recommend you just buy a melodica. They're really cheap, and it basically has the same fingering as a keyboard, but the articulation of a wind instrument. The ending of this piece really takes a turn. All of a sudden, this light-hearted dance becomes a furious display of rapid notes in extremely pianistic fashion. This section from measures 73 to 76 create the greatest orchestration challenge of the entire piece. Just look at all these notes. If you're scratching your head looking at the score and listening to this, wondering which instruments could possibly even play this, it's time to take a different approach. This is the point where you can consider possibly changing some things and doing some composing of your own in order to keep the orchestration from spiking in difficulty and becoming unplayable. Maurice Ravel is widely considered to be one of the greatest masters of orchestration. When he was orchestrating his own piece, Alborada del Gracioso, he ran into a similar problem. Let's take a look and see what he did in order to overcome these challenges. Now with this in mind, let's take a look at the passage in question. Upon giving it a closer look, we notice that the rapid notes from measure 74 up to the middle of 75 are just two different pitches repeated in different octaves. These are the fundamental notes in the groups of three. Instead of alternating between them, I have repeated patterns of triplets which created the same level of excitement but without being too difficult to play. By switching off between the different stringed instrument sections as the shape of the passage rises and falls and then rises again, we've created the same basic structure of the cadenza. However, if you look closely in the piano score, you'll notice that it's marked pedal throughout the entire cadenza. This means that all the notes will ring even after they are played. So in order to emulate this effect, I've divided all the strings into groups of 4, shown with 2 staves per section. The top stave of each section effectively plays the rhythmic pattern of the cadenza, while the bottom stave of each section uses an appropriate and creative effect to give the impression of sustained notes from the pedal. These effects include false harmonics, extremely short articulation, rapid dynamic changes like fortissimo piano, and tremolo. On top of this effect, I employ similar strategies with the low woodwinds and horns. One of these effects which I personally love is the use of the horns playing stopped notes. By closing and opening their fists inside the bell, horn players can create different colors to either mute or muffle the note. Marked with a plus sign, the stopped note at measure 76 would sound extremely bright and brassy, but because it's marked forte piano, the articulated note would quickly get out of the way of the overall texture. Inspired by Ravel, another technique I employed was flutter tongue in the flute and the piccolo. Marked FLZ, this technique is the woodwind equivalent of tremolo. Any wind player who can roll their R's can do flutter tongue, so it's never out of the question as far as possible effects. It's especially effective in the extreme high notes and works best on the flute and sometimes clarinet. Unfortunately, double reed instruments can't really do flutter tongue because of the nature of their embouchure. In this case, it works perfectly to have the first flute and the piccolo emulate the piano tremolo between 2 notes in different octaves. In combination with the wash of tense sound created by the extremely high false harmonics and tremolo in the strings, this passage is very effective.